Welcome to this episode of Bounded in a Nutshell. Remember to take a moment to click on the link below to donate to a very special organization. Figure Skating in Harlem is the first organization in the world to combine the power of education with the grace and discipline of figure skating. It is dedicated to developing confidence, leadership, and academic achievement in young girls from low-income backgrounds. The numerous stories of success from its alumni owe a great deal to the unique blend of mentoring and self-expression that is championed by FSH. Remember, no donation is too small or too large to keep the dream alive for these exceptional young girls. Thank you very much. Enjoy the show. Welcome to the second episode of Bounded in a Nutshell. My guest today is Michael Greif. Michael is the four-time Tony-nominated director of multiple acclaimed Broadway productions, which include Rent, Grey Gardens, Dear Evan Hansen, and War Paint. His off-Broadway credits include Landscape of the Body, Mrs. Sharp, Bright Lights, Big City, Giant, Angels in America, Winter's Tale, Romeo and Juliet, and The Tempest. Michael's work often tackles and sheds a light on the gaping holes in society, whether it be the growing AIDS epidemic amongst artist communities of the East Village, as in Rent, depression, drug abuse, and the bipolar condition in Next to Normal, or dysfunctional families, as in Grey's Garden, or socioeconomic and inequality and global warming, as in my personal favorite, Below Road. His vibrant, layered, humorous, and detailed direction has cemented his position as one of the most exciting and relevant directors working today. Michael, you can pay me later for that one.
I thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We have some very exciting guests watching this, and we'll open it up to a question and answer towards the end. But why don't we start at the beginning? As one of the few New Yorkers who are actually born and raised in New York, tell me a little bit about Brooklyn growing up.
I grew up in Brighton Beach, which is a community right next to Coney Island.
Yeah.
I grew up in the 60s, early 70s. Real working class background. I didn't realize what the economic condition of the family really was until I got a little further away from it and I got to college. The neighborhood was really always in transition. Most of my generation, most of my cousins, as I was growing up, moved out to the suburbs. I didn't recognize at the time that we couldn't afford to do that. I actually always recognized, I always liked that because there was something very honky-tonky about the neighborhood and the visits to Coney Island, and there was always a little danger. There was, you had to really keep your wits about you, but I thought it was fascinating. I had two older sisters, one who was 5 years older, who really showed me a lot about the world, had an awful lot to do with what my taste would be. She exposed me to, lots of albums. She exposed me to the Vietnam War protests. I really lived a lot of my life in her shadow as a kid. She really had a great influence on me, and her tastes became my tastes. But when I got to like junior high school, I started recognizing that it was a pretty easy subway ride to Manhattan, and I began to know different parts of the city in a way. But I think one of the most interesting aspects about my neighborhood growing up was I didn't recognize just how full of Holocaust survivors it was. My entire generation was moving out, but my neighbors were the elderly, and an awful lot of them had tattoos on their arms. I remember, walking down the street when the film version of Fiddler on the Roof came out, like the first time it was shown on television.
Yeah.
I don't know why I was down the street. I was probably walking my dog or something. And like every television on the block, you could see in every apartment building, because it was a very, dense apartment building kind of neighborhood, mostly low rises, 6 floors, 8 floors, but all apartment buildings. And you could see that in every window was reflected the same frame of Fiddler on the Roof. I really got a sense of just how homogeneous the neighborhood was. I didn't really have a sense of that until that moment. Um, when I went away to college in the late 70s, I came back from my first Christmas break. I went to Chicago, and half of the building were now Russian immigrants. It was the moment that there was some sort of trade embargo between the Soviet Union and the States, and I don't know what the UJN had to do with it, but certainly for the first time there were waves and waves and waves of Russian immigrants coming to New York and other parts of the country, and they really settled in Brighton Beach, which they called Odessa by the Sea, and now it's really a heavily Russian neighborhood, and it continues to be completely fascinating to visit that neighborhood. It was always like on the verge of something else.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
It was always in transition in some way, or maybe the kind of place where you just want to get the hell out of. But there was something about that.
That you wanted to stay with that. So
that I found really
you mentioned seeing Fiddler on the Roof, and because one of the things I want to say, how from that background you end up, being this Broadway producer specifically with so many musicals, was that an imprint in your mind, Fiddler on the Roof, and that style?
I get, that kind of storytelling, it could be. I mean, I didn't move into the theater or study the theater imagining that I would be directing musicals. Sort of fell into it with Rent, but you're right to say that I always was taken with that kind of storytelling. I always loved that synthesis of music and storytelling. I always loved the emotionality of that kind of storytelling. And there was also, a greater theatricality to musical theater. Certainly in the 70s and the 80s, than there was to many of the kitchen sink dramas that were
big. So when you say you didn't study, so what were you aiming for before?
Fancy shit.
Highbrow shit.
Really
stuff.
Fancy shit.
Yeah.
I was very interested in Beckett. I certainly studied Shakespeare. I just imagined that I would be doing new versions of the classics like some of my heroes were doing at the time. Those people were Robert Woodruff, Joanne Ecolitis, Peter Sellers, directors who were really rethinking classics. And that was the rigor that I was, preparing for. Probably always felt a little insecure about, but those were my aspirations when I was studying theater as an undergrad and then as a graduate.
Could you explain, just you say the insecure thing, because I find, you mentioned Shakespeare as one of the things I'm really intrigued that I was really drawn by when I came to the States and started spending more time, is that seeming insecurity around Shakespeare. I don't know why, because I think some of the I remember the very first audition I had moving back to England after drama school here was actually at the RSC, Royal Shakespeare Company. And I remember going in there with a bit of, I've been in America for a while. Will I be able to get into this, my dream job? And I remember the late Stephen Pimlott was the first director. I ended up doing a whole series of directors that same day. And Stephen Pimlott was the first one. And I remember him saying, I really like the way your muscular way of mouthing the words, which was very much the mid-Atlantic thing I picked up being in America. So there was aspects of what I was bringing over to America that immediately made him hire me. And yet there seems to be over here in the States a slight sort of tentativeness or a slight sort of, if I'm going to be crude about it, the Brits do it better when it comes to Shakespeare. And how do you feel? I mean, is that something that played into your head?
Not the particular insecurity that I'm referring to. I was really, I really had my big break at the New York Shakespeare Festival. I did a production on my own. I actually self-produced a revival of a play called Mackinac, and it was one of those, what were they called? equity showcase,
Hmm.
it wasn't equity waiver, that's an LA thing. It was like an equity showcase. I think you
Right.
could pay people terribly and
Yeah.
do like 12 performances.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
There's a version of that still going on now, isn't
probably, yes.
there?
And
Yeah.
yes, and we can justify it in many ways and
Many
criticize
ways.
it in
Yeah.
many ways,
Yeah.
but really worked out for me, certainly. So I was doing this production with 12 performances, and and then Kevin Kline came to see it. I think he did that because an old friend of mine was a colleague of his, and then he ultimately brought Joe Papp, to see it.
Yeah.
And I, just a few years out of graduate school, got a meeting with Joe Papp and got to talk about a hypothetical production of a play by Václav Havel. And then he actually asked me to become an associate director there.
Wow.
So, which was really extraordinary and really did blow my mind.
Yeah.
Um, and I certainly grew up going to the Delacorte and seeing whatever I could see. From the time I was in high school, I started really seeing theater in New York, which was another great advantage of actually
Hmm.
staying in Brooklyn, the easy access
Yeah.
to so many theater spaces in New York. And it really had a profound effect on me. A lot of the productions I saw, and a lot of them were specifically at the Public. Um, so I had grown up with a lot of those, as you say, muscular or colloquial Shakespeares.
Yes.
And I always responded incredibly well to them. You know,
Good.
I,
Yeah.
I always understood and loved the sort of the home ground, the home
Hmm.
team version. So it wasn't only that, it wasn't just that. It was just sort of, I spoke about some of those directors,
Hmm.
that I was
Yeah.
looking up to. And there were British directors in that category then
Yeah.
and still are. It really, it has more to do with intellectual rigor.
Right.
For me, do I feel like I have the rigor to reinterpret this fully? And I feel like what's happened as I gain more experience and I just accept more about who I am, you come to a place where you feel there are things you can bring that
Hmm.
others can't bring, and
Right.
there are things that others will do a whole lot better than you.
Right.
So, I mean, that's what happened with my sort of decades working.
Right. Well, let's leap then. We get to what I guess your first workshop was around 93 or something like that, 94. And this thing, Rent, happens. Your young director, I mean, you explode very much onto that sort of musical world scene
Yeah.
and a groundbreaking production. And I remember seeing that actually. I think I probably contributed to part of the financial crash that eventually happened because a lot of my friends, I started off in economics. So a lot of my friends were interning in the city and I would come stay with them. And one of the treats we had was to get tickets, these prize tickets to go see, Rent. How do you, I mean, tell us a little bit about that when you
Yeah.
realized this thing was becoming this incredible phenomenon. And let's keep in mind those things you've already said about the insecurities, this kid from Brooklyn, this massive production, and all the questions you must have asked yourself post the success. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Uh, the thing that's unbelievably singular about Rent is
Yeah.
that every memory, you know, every anything I can talk about is so completely overshadowed by Jonathan Larson's death.
Yes.
There's such a before and after story. So I'll start with the before.
Right.
Which was really, like business as usual. It was like,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, uh, 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 I had met Jonathan when I was actually doing that production of that. I mentioned that production of
Mackinac.
that equity waiver show.
Yeah.
I
Mackinac.
actually
Yeah.
met him because we had a lot of friends in common with a group called Naked Angels who actually produced that show with me.
Right.
A few years later, when I was working at the Public, Jonathan did a reading of another musical. Joe had died at this point, and Joanne Akalaitis and George Wolfe and David Greenspan and I were all associate directors at the time. And I think we had a meeting in which it became very clear that, we would divvy up responsibilities, especially in terms of reading scripts and seeing readings.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if I volunteered or if I was, if they volunteered for me, but I was the one who was assigned Jonathan's reading.
Yeah.
And so we met at that time, and we engaged in a professional kind of relationship. And then about a year or two later, I got a call from Jim Nicola, who I also had a previous relationship with. He was the artistic director at the New York Theater Workshop.
Right.
Jim was the artistic director there probably for about 5 years at that time, maybe 7. But the really smart thing Jim did when he became the artistic director at the New York, among the very smart things Jim did when he became the artistic director, is he formed a group of alums of something called the New Directors Workshop. This was a group, I think, of about 20 of us who had been selected from like 86 through 91 to do productions. You had to apply. It was a really great gig for emerging directors.
Mm-hmm.
So many of my colleagues who are still working today are alums of that program. I think that Jim really wisely, as a way of connecting the New York Theater Workshop of the 80s with the New York Theater Workshop of the 90s, is he got us all together in a group, and we would talk about what our theatrical aspirations were, where we saw, we just talked about theater. So I had already had a relationship with him. So in 93, I think, when Rent won something called the Richard Rogers Award, they were looking to produce a staged reading of it. And Jim and Jonathan started putting directors together. In my time since then, I've learned I wasn't the absolute first choice. But
when are we ever the first choice? There's always someone. If everyone's the first choice,
another good lesson. It's another good lesson to impart. You don't always have to be the first choice.
Yes, I just want to hear I am. I never believe it. I just want you to say it.
Yeah, I've actually probably can. My greatest success is I've probably been 2 or 3. So it's a
yes, that's pretty good. Yeah.
So Jim asked me to, read a script, listen to some songs. Lots of the songs that are still in the musical were there then, including some of the best songs, Another Day, Light My Candle. But he was really asking me, was I interested in working with Jonathan to continue to develop the material, which was really exciting to me. I loved a lot of the material. I thought a lot of other parts of the material were a little indulgent.
Mm-hmm.
At that point in my career, I was certainly interested in that subject matter.
Mm-hmm.
I had really, really, really wanted to direct Angels in America. I was really thrilled a million years later to have the opportunity to direct Angels in America. I felt acquainted with material that was inspired by the AIDS crisis. And I felt that the best part about Rent was that there was a very sincere and very heartfelt cry, really just a lament about the friends of Jonathan that were being taken from him way too soon. And I felt that there was a real authenticity about the way those people were being honored that I was really attracted to. And I also thought that a lot of the music was really terrific and really doing the things that Jim, Nicola, and Jonathan really wanted the music to do, which was to bridge that distance between popular music and musical theater, which has gone away, in years. The other thing was that we were building the production for the New York Theater Workshop. It was a very specific space with an audience that I understood because I went to that theater all the time. And we were talking about young versions of the people who worked at that theater and went to that theater. So there was a real there was a real bar in terms of authenticity. You know, Rent was always an idealized version of the world, a version of what artists could do, an idealized version of how we could take care of one another. But because of where we were, there was also a lot of attention paid to, let's make sure we're not insulting the younger versions of so many of the people who work here and who go to the theater here. So the development of the material kept very much that in mind, and the way to produce the show kept that very much in mind. We did a very informative and inspirational workshop, like in '94, I think the fall of '94. We did it up on the third floor rehearsal room at the New York Theater Workshop, which is a space that means a great deal to me. And we did it with a minimum of props, and we did it with some tables that would tables and chairs would transform into a lot of other things. And then when we began to think of a production, it really became clear that the really, you know, ad hoc, do it yourself, make something out of nothing aesthetic
is worth pursuing.
Production really needed to be the hallmark of the production.
Right.
You know, I think at that point I just really kept asking myself, why do I see these readings? Why do I see these productions which hint at, which suggest what might be? Why are they so much more rewarding than these productions that answer all these questions? Especially in musicals, which tend to be very cinematic. I mean, Jonathan wrote that script in a very challenging cinematic way.
Right.
So it just seemed like, oh, the more theatrically, the more transformationally, the more imaginatively we could conceive this, the better. Yeah. And then the casting process was also really revelatory.
I mean, I'm looking at all the careers that exploded out of this production. I mean, Anthony Rapp and, you know, Daphne, and it's weird because my first independent film moving here was with Daphne Rubin Vega, who's just amazing, you know. And then I remember a couple of years back at one of those award circuit shows, Idina Menzel, you know, getting some kind of achievement award, and that, you know, so very much started. I mean, I have to ask this because I'm sure there's a lot of directors out there and also a lot of actors figuring out, is that the process of, I don't know if it was Richard Eyre or who said in his memoirs that 90%, or whether it was Sam Mendes, I don't know, but 90% of the job for them is done in casting, you know. How do you feel about that idea? You know,
I agree with a lot of what Richard Eyre says about a lot of things.
I love him. He's like my fairy godfather. I just love working with him. He's amazing.
Yes. He was one of those English directors back then, and remains one of those directors that, I mean, you know, I still really love everything.
Well, I can see the links with whatever, because one of the strengths of Richard is that it's very clear he wants to put the show together, and he puts a lot of trust in his actors to get their work done while he orchestrates a show. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And that's and I remember working with you in The Low Road and all those. I mean, we'll come to that later, but that whole thing about casting and that casting, like, there's certain directors that love, I mean, I did, the first time I met you, I think, was you were casting The Tempest and stuff. And I came in and it was a very rigorous casting, whatever, you really push for choices. And then there's directors like Igor Van Hoofse, who after 7 seconds, he's decided whether he wants to work with you, and I would like the audition to end as soon as possible. What is your whole thing with casting? Because I think there's a lot of people watching that be interested in to know, you know? I want to be fooled in the casting process that your essence, the auditioning actor's essence, is the essence of the character. You know, I think long ago I would have said, I just want them to show me that they're matching essences. And now I realize that really good actors can fool me, you know. And, you know, good, fool me, we'll fool the audience, we'll fool them together. But,
but there are qualities that you come to see in characters, and some of those qualities need to be exploited so that you have a really rich, the ingredients for the whole are really rich, and people want to retain their flavors. Do you know what I
Yes.
mean?
Yes.
We talk a lot about everyone being on the same page and everyone, being in the same production. And believe me, I recognize the importance of that.
You're
But
right.
I feel like, you probably felt this in the low road. I mean, what was so yummy was how everyone kept their own flavor too. You
Absolutely.
know what I mean?
Yes.
Like
Yes.
there were such strong hits. There was such character behind everyone in that production.
Absolutely.
That was a joy to cast as well. But
Yes.
so that's what we were looking for when we cast Rent, is we were really looking, or I for like the biggest hit. Do you know what I mean? And we learned a lot, Jonathan and me and John and our fantastic music director, Tim Wild, when we did this workshop in 94, which was hugely informative and exciting. And I got to tell you, some of those actors in 94 we invited back and they said, no, thank you. So
Wow.
they're unhappy actors now. And it opened the door for us to really be able to reassess and see a different, a different flavor, a different essence in some of those
Right.
parts. But we just really were looking for variety and authenticity. And
And is that in general what you look for, really? That you don't want a homogenous sort of set,
yeah,
that you bring what you have and let's fit it into the world. Do you know what I
yeah,
mean? Is that
let's find the way in which we naturally relate to one another. I mean, we always bring our own distinct essences to something, and yet
yeah.
we interact, we relate, we accommodate.
Yeah.
All those things need to happen. But yeah, I'm looking for people who can hold on to their essences.
That's
And
good to know. I think that's really important because one of the things we actors, Jessica Hecht was on yesterday and stuff, and she talked about that mistake we initially make, which is trying to figure out what we think they want us to do or
yeah,
what we think they want us to sound like or behave.
yeah.
When actually it's all about the rules of attraction, isn't it? It's like,
Yeah, but
the,
I want to know that the actor can interpret the material
yes,
intelligently and surprisingly and fully.
yes,
That's I really want to see that too. And maybe that's what you were experiencing at the Tempest audition.
yes,
Is
yeah.
that like, and and if I like somebody in audition, I'll just ask them to do it differently to see what the adjustment process
Yeah,
is like.
yeah,
Like, how are we going to work together?
yeah.
Can you take and adjust? So, there's that. But I sometimes really feel the need to have the casting director reach out to an actor and say, please let them know they did a great job. They're just not I don't think they're the right person for this role at this
Yeah.
moment. They
You
did a
were another,
great
you did
they did
that.
a
You did
great
that.
job.
Yeah, you did. I think it's a very important because one of those things we're talking about is not getting a role doesn't mean you did anything wrong.
Yeah,
Do
yeah,
you know
yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah. So
And
I
stuff.
think, I think it's important for people to hear that, especially when I think it, because like the only way we generally get, the feedback is you got the job, you got a call back, you didn't get,
Yeah.
So
No, it's important, and it was very much that, and like you say, and then it's weird because you're also a director, and again to the young directors that might be watching this, who I mean, I saw you all over. I mean, I remember you even came to see Kristen and Lloyd was in it, but you came to see the mobile unit Hamlet and stuff.
which was
Someone who's
damn
go,
good.
yeah. Well, if I may say so myself, but
It was
again, I just
good.
thought it was so impressive your commitment, not just to your former actors, but commitment to seeing shows wherever they may be. Maybe that has something to do with Joe Pap coming to see your little
Yeah,
thing initially at the beginning. And I think that says a lot.
I like to think that's true. I'd
Yeah,
like to think that's true. And
yeah,
I try to get out to a whole variety of different kinds of spaces too.
yeah,
It's easy to sort of like just get in the habit of these 6 theaters or
yeah.
those Broadway plays. But I really like getting out and about to unexpected places too.
So here's another thing is, okay, so now after that success, I mean, one thing I've experienced is that people think, oh, you're there now, and it's all plain sailing. I'm guessing that wasn't probably the case. What was your situation? I'm guessing
Yeah, well,
it
here's,
isn't.
you know,
Because some people
I'll,
often think struggle only belongs to the beginning of your career, or struggle only belongs to when you're trying to get there, then you're fine. When actually we're constantly navigating. What do you
totally true.
do? You've hit rent has happened. How do you even go about picking your next project? How soon did the next project come? What were the expectations on you on that, afterwards?
It was, yes, that changed. I was actually the artistic director of the La Jolla Playhouse
Right.
while the Rent phenomenon became the Rent phenomenon.
Yeah.
Um, I was in the very enviable position of being able to really select the projects I wanted to select.
Mm-hmm.
I was really in that enviable position where the funding community was looking at me and they were
Right.
looking at the Playhouse. One of the things I was able to do is commission some favorite playwrights to adapt fiction, which was always something I was interested in. We did a lot of that at Northwestern. As an undergrad, I did a lot of adaptation of fiction. I asked my friend Jessica Hagedorn to adapt her sensational novel Dog Eaters, among other things. So that was the best of it. And then I was also asked, to look at a lot of crap, and again, I was in the very enviable position to say no to a lot of crap, to a lot of, imitations, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
Not always the most imaginative community.
Yeah.
So I was looking at a lot of garbage, and it was easy to turn down garbage, but I also really had, a lab at my disposal. It was a very, really good time, a really fortunate time to be able to be in a place where I could do my own programming and even fund my own programming. I realized it was really important. Then I started, getting concerned that I wasn't getting Broadway shows, and I made a really big mistake. And I agreed to direct a musical version of Swing Time, the Fred Astaire Ginger Rogers musical.
Right.
And it was really a bomb. It really scarred me, and it really taught me a lot of things.
Yeah.
And it took me a lot of years to get back on Broadway with Grey Gardens. I mean,
so
I really
so you go from Rent, and it took you a lot of years to get back to Broadway. I think that's I just want that to be, we're not here for doom and gloom, but to sort of like establish the realism of the business. It's not so much that first thing, is what you do next. It's what you,
absolutely. And Next was not good. And Next was an unwise choice. I mean, I had been doing work I was proud of, in all sorts of off-Broadway theaters. I was doing work regionally. I felt good about a lot of the work I was doing. And it was probably a little, arrogant to feel like I could do this Broadway production of this nostalgic musical.
Right. I have two more things I want to, before we open up to questions, is coming to the Low Road and working with you on that. There were all the logistics of the smallest backstage space in New York, working in the Anspacher. This show with 19 actors or whatever it was. We were the incredible material by Bruce Norris. Bruce is actually, thank you. Bruce is actually going to be coming on this show later down, so that should be quite entertaining.
Fantastic. Really fantastic.
And not a show that, again, is in that world of what you're doing. There were issues to be discussed, and as usual, with humor and detail and stuff. But one of the things I recognize with you, and tell me if I'm wrong, as a director, if I don't like the word style, but if I were going to say something about you, movement and how literally you move, or something is moved off, or when the music comes in, is a massive part of the characterization of the play as a body for you, right? In general, I mean, well, the show of it, the
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 rhythm.
chair doesn't just get moved. It has to be moved in a certain, so there's this holistic dialogue. And I remember that in Rent also, like the edginess of it and stuff, and the way that people, and even how people would turn to talk to someone. When you, as a director, I mean, I don't know how quite to phrase this, but the choreography of a
Yeah.
piece is central to you, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, the way something moves and the way something sounds
Mm-hmm.
are the way something feels. You know, I think that in a lot of ways, it's very, very, very much a part of the director's toolbox
Mm-hmm.
is how we get from place to place in the
Mm-hmm.
show. And I think a lot of it is lessons learned early on that seemed successful, that seemed like I wanted to hold on to. You
Right.
say a lot about the world you're creating
Mm-hmm.
in the way in which you move from place to place. You know, the who labors, how they labor.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, when there is soothing sound, when there's welcoming sound, when there's hostile sound,
Mm-hmm.
you know, when there's insidious sound. You know, I mean, I guess it's just like movie scoring, but
Yeah.
you know, the dramatic event for me has a lot to do with not only what happens in scene, but what happens between the scenes in
Right.
order to fully fund what happens in the scenes.
And going on that is that sadly you won't be able to join us on Friday for a workshop because you are we allowed to talk about your
I'm
next
doing
project?
this 29
Michael,
hour Zoom
go on,
week.
tell us about that.
You know, many of my colleagues have already participated in this. This will be my first. I was going to be doing a lab of a musical workshop next week, you know, for 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
We went through a whole casting process that really ended right when quarantine hit. I think we were doing callbacks minutes before, you know, the shelter inside
Was announced.
was yes. Um,
Besides, even if it was announced, New York actors will get there.
I mean, New York actors really got there, and then I think very fortunately we were all told at the same moment, you know, put your pencils down, we're done for now. It was really excellent timing. Anyway, so we put together a great company very early in March for this April lab, which we're now gonna do, you know, on Zoom. We're gonna do
Right, and it's for
29. Oh, I don't want to say what it's for. Do you mind that I'm going to keep that secret for the moment?
okay.
You'll find it in Playbill. But
okay, fantastic. And so right now we're at the stage where we're gonna like open up to a couple of questions from and Michelle, are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, do we have any juicy questions for Michael?
We do have some good questions.
Great.
Okay, so one of the first questions is from Dan, and it's, when staging Shakespeare, what premium do you put on unpacking the language versus, or in addition to, making the moment relatable?
I feel like they're the same thing. You know, I feel like we really have to, you know, when I've done Shakespeare, we've done an awful lot of table work and we've done an awful lot of interpretation. And we've done certain substitution when something, you know, is completely indecipherable. Sometimes we cut, sometimes I've made small changes, but I've always spent a lot of time figuring out what everything means, but all of that is in order to make it as relatable as possible.
Great.
Great, yeah. Okay, we've got another question. One person would like to know, I believe this is from Garrett, what theater and theater makers most excite you right now in the American theater?
What theater makers excite me most? And what theaters, you know, I'm gonna start with the theaters. I've been trying, you know, the Bushwick Star is a theater I really am trying to get at, to meet new writers and to meet new directors. This is not new for me, but I've had a long association with Ralph Pena, who runs Mai, and that's another theater I really, really love getting to, and they're in a variety of spaces. The theater makers who excite me a lot, and I'm going to be a little tone deaf to the really, really young folks, but I really love seeing what Sam Gold is up to all the time and really try to get there whenever possible. Lila Newberger, I'm going to say her last name wrong, but do we all know Lila, who works at the Signature a lot? She did The Wolves. I always try to get out and see what she's up to. Robert O'Hara, I think, is extraordinary. And I was just like so completely blown away by A Raisin in the Sun last season at Williamstown. I know we're going to get to see that. You know, I'd also thought Booty Candy was unbelievable. So his work,
Yeah.
you know,
we'll go with those.
We'll go with those for now. And then, you know, I always love to see what Evo is up to.
Yeah.
Always. I always like to see what Sam Mendes is up to.
You're naming my favorite people here, Mike.
They both had stuff on Broadway right before things closed. I mean, did you get to see the West Side Story or the Lehman?
I did get to see West Side Story, and I am a big unabashed fan of it. I thought it was really thrilling. I thought the choreography was thrilling. I thought that I was going to say Romeo. I thought that Tony was you know, and I love the juxtaposition of the tiny image and the enormous image, and what that, you know, constantly change, how the meaning of that constantly changed throughout the evening. And I also saw the Lehman Brothers when it was at at, you know, the Armory. So I was looking forward to seeing that.
Can I just ask you, with directors, when you say you go see directors, and I'm trying to think of in terms of actors who go see other actors, and, you know, that little bit of love and envy, that's that little soup that comes into watching other. When you go see their work, is it for inspiration or just sheer enjoyment of the fact that you like seeing their work? Or
it's a combination of it's certainly a combination. You know, there were certain people who, you know, I have a little expectation, you know, but it's always about being surprised.
Yeah.
And like you said, I go to the theater a lot, so I see a lot of different work, a lot of different kind of work, and I think it's really important to stay exposed and to, you know, get inspired by a lot of different people in a lot of different ways.
This is another sort of question I've been playing. I have a few young female director friends that, and, you know, you can tell over the genesis of the last 30 years in theater. And for the longest time, it was very, shall we say, white male dominated. And, you know, we're getting some good, strong female directors finally being put out there and stuff. Do you think it's an evolving, and it's changing fast enough, and it's opening up fast enough for everyone, I guess, you know? Because it was one of the last aspects.
I got it.
No, and you aside, I love you, Michael. We all love you. This isn't about that, but it was the directing, the side of it, which is directing, is probably the last segment that has, I would say, changed more slowly when you think of acting and casting and, you know, production and stuff like that. And is that a part of the industry that's opening up, and is it more and more in your experience?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is. And I'm very aware of when I get a job. You know, I sometimes get a job because I get a job with an all women writing team. So it's okay that, you know, a gay man like me could be a part of that. You know, a white guy like me. Yes, but certainly I'm aware of the fact that new teams are forming all the time, and I'm in a very, very, very fortunate place.
Yeah.
To be in a very satisfied place, to
Mm-hmm.
feel like I can naturally continue to do the work I want to do or that's offered to me, and it will be enough.
Mm-hmm.
And I will very happily and gracefully get out of the way to make room for a lot of other folks who are coming up. And I believe that.
That's beautiful.
But I think
Thank
that's
you.
really good. I think that's lucky timing on my
Yeah.
part. If
Yeah.
I were 30 and this were happening, I'd probably feel differently about it.
Yeah.
I would probably have to say to myself that it is absolutely the right thing, but
Yeah.
it's that much easier for me to say it's the right thing now because
Right.
of all of the lucky breaks I've had, because I was in that club, and the club
That's
was a
great.
little exclusive for a long time.
Great. Michelle?
Yeah, I've got a good question from Julian, I believe, that how much of the physicality and use of space do you look for in an audition setting? How much does that contribute to seeing the essence of the character?
You mean like, is the question about how much of a sense of how the actor and character move through a space? Is that what the question means?
Yeah, and I think that the actor is looking for how important this aspect is during an audition.
Again, it relates to the thing I talked about earlier, which is like how fooled am I by how much you match up with the essence of the character. If the character swaggers, if the character has real physical confidence, I need to see that. I want to see that. If the character is shut down, if the character is physically insecure, if the character is frightened, I want to be able to see that too. And I certainly want your body to go along with what your head and your mouth are doing. I think that answers the question.
Yeah, that sounds great. Dan would also love to hear about the kind of balancing act that has to happen when you're freelancing versus an artistic director, and how they feed into each other.
Yeah, that's really complicated and a wonderful question, and changes, I think, a lot as our theater models change. When I first dreamed of being an artistic director, I was looking at theater models like Trinity Rep, which was a theater run by Adrian Hall, in which he directed every goddamn production. Like, it was like 4 productions of Adrian Hall every season, with a fantastic, community that raised money for him. This to me was like, yeah, I want to be an artistic director. That's what I want to do. By the time I was actually looking at artistic director jobs, up for artistic director jobs, and then being an artistic director, it was very much, there was a time in the season where you could direct, and it was economically advantageous for the theater for you to direct. And of course, you had a lot of autonomy in what you chose to direct, like what I talked about in that just post-Rent moment of my career. But there was a lot of time that was spent in putting out an artistic vision for the theater. I'm thinking of Oscar now. I'm thinking of George, really great artistic directors of the public, who how much of their job is forming a vision and communicating that vision, and then raising a lot of money for that vision, and taking care of artists who fall within that vision. And I found that I was that I was a little more selfish, and what I wanted to do was to look after my vision more than others. And when I had the opportunity to leave La Jolla as an artistic director, I did. And I started working. I moved back to New York City and started working off-Broadway almost. I started working as a freelance director at that time.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, and so segueing from the off-Broadway to Broadway, I think we have a few people here that would love to hear about Dear Evan Hansen.
Great. Okay.
Let's hear about it.
Yeah, they would just love to hear about the experience and
anything.
Yeah.
sometimes you get really lucky and you're really fortunate, and you read something that's really fantastic. I, after the big bomb on Broadway, some years went by, and I was really fortunate to get to direct Grey Gardens, which I felt like I had a lot more to bring to the table with a show like that. And I think Grey Gardens really led to Next to Normal. And then Next to Normal started feeling like, oh, this guy who directed Rent and Next to Normal, there's something you can depend on. There's an aesthetic there. There's a worldview there. There's a skill set there, that linked those musicals up, So I felt like I moved into a different category. And I was in that very fortunate category when Benj and Justin and Stephen Levinson and Stacy Mindich were looking for a director for Dear Evan Hansen. I had wonderfully met Benj and Justin while we were rehearsing Next to Normal. They actually were observers. They had been out of school a very short time. They observed Tom Kitt and Brian Yorkie and my process. So I got to meet them, which was fantastic. This experience with Rent, those three extraordinary writers and that wonderful producer, they sent the material, I think, to a bunch of, I know they set up a number of interviews with a number of directors, all of whom I knew well. They were my peer group. And really, 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 really fortunately, I got the gig. I think I got the gig because I was able to express to them how much I really loved the material, which was true. And I think I was able to show them that I had some sense of the physical world of the production, and I had some insight into some of the characters, that were on the page at that time. So I think those were the things that got me the gig. And then we engaged on we then engaged in a very intense, like 10-day long process of how we could imagine a production, and the material changed a great deal. It was always a really, really, really vigorous, rigorous, and rewarding time, because I just thought that those writers and Alex Lacamoire and Danny Medford, our choreographer, all were working at the most extraordinary levels. And all of our designers everyone was just bringing their best because we all believed in the material so much. A lot of people have heard me say this, but it's pretty remarkable that a lot of the actors who did the very first reading of Dear Evan Hansen, stuck with it for years of development, because they too recognized just how original, how urgent, how sophisticated, and how moving the material was.
And I remember during the time of Loro, despite getting that massive show on the road, you were constantly still involved very much in that. So is that something, I'm one of those actors, this is my question, who, when the director leaves a production, I feel kind of sad. Because I feel that I'm happiest during previews. The idea of trying it out and getting notes, trying it out. I wish the whole run of a show could be like that. So I'm always one of those that actually doesn't like to see it, because sometimes when directors leave, they leave. But you keep sort of like you check in quite a bit. Was that just for us because you were scared of leaving Kevin Chamberlain, Harriet Harrison, like alone in a show, or is it something that you do in general?
I like checking in, and I really like checking in, and I also and those runs, at the public, they're brief. Our previews are long. Our previews are extensive. And then the runs are so brief. Especially, like the end of week one, you really want to see, like, what's this like without constant supervision? And then, but after that, it's often a real pleasure to come back and see how things develop. And
have you ever come back and you've gone, a bit like that wonderful moment in Noises Off when the director comes back and sees that disaster shows become.
Yeah. And sometimes, you know, that happens out of town when you're a little more out of town for me, when you're unable to visit.
Yeah.
But no, I have visited certain productions that have gone severely off the rails.
Do you let people know about that, or are you subtle in your?
Yeah. No. You can do that. And, you know, and always there were members of that company who are like, yeah, damn right, we've gone off the rails. Like,
yeah.
You know, there's people, I think, welcome a return.
Wonderful.
You know,
I do. I would rather the exit doesn't happen.
Yeah, but you have to also understand that there's a different agreement. Do you know what I mean? There's the power dynamic has shifted slightly, and you have to recognize and respect, you know, the experience that the actor is having that you're not having by not being there all the time.
Such a joy working with you on the Low Road. I think
I look forward to our next professional endeavor.
Absolutely. Just don't ask me to sing. And
thank you all very, very, very much. It was a real pleasure. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.